You know, in the dark theater of the Soviet Union, there was one man who played pretty much every role you can imagine. The loyal servant, the ruthless executioner, the super-efficient manager, and a truly depraved predator. He was this man of terrifying contradictions, a figure so monstrous that even his boss, Joseph Stalin, had a pretty chilling way of describing him. Today we're diving into the story of that man, Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's most monstrous servant.
So picture this. It's the Yalta Conference in 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt is sitting right across from Stalin. And Stalin, he just casually gestures to his secret police chief and calls him our Heinrich Himmler. Just think about that for a second. It's this shocking, almost off-the-cuff admission, comparing his right-hand man to the main architect of the Holocaust. And you know what? It wasn't an exaggeration. It was basically his job description.
All right, so to really get a handle on this incredibly complex and horrifying figure, we're going to break his story down into 6 parts. First, we'll dig into his relationship with Stalin. Then, we'll trace his absolutely ruthless climb to the top. After that, we'll get into his central role as the architect of Soviet terror. Then comes the really weird part, his work on the atomic bomb. We'll also uncover his horrific secret life, and finally, we'll watch it all come crashing down.
Beria wasn't just some guy who worked for Stalin. He was an absolutely indispensable tool. I mean, Stalin was the master of paranoia, right? He needed somebody who could figure out his darkest wishes and then just carry him out, no questions asked. And Beria, with his slick flattery and total lack of a moral compass, was the perfect man for the job. He became the most feared and powerful enforcer in the entire Soviet Union.
So you have to ask yourself, how does a boy from a tiny Georgian village become the hangman of a global superpower? Well, Beria's journey didn't really start with ideology. It was all about raw, naked ambition. The chaos of the Russian Revolution, well, for a cunning and disciplined young man like him, it was the perfect ladder to climb.
What's really wild when you look at this is just how fast he rose through the ranks. In 1919, he's just a young agent. 2 years later, he's in the Cheka, the original Bolshevik secret police. But in 1924, that's when he really made his name. He brutally crushes a Georgian nationalist uprising. We're talking a massacre that leads to around 10,000 executions. An act of pure, calculated brutality like that, it gets you noticed. By 32, he's the party boss for the entire region. And then, in 1938, Stalin calls him to Moscow to take over the NKVD, the secret police, right at the peak of the Great Purge.
And this is where Beria goes from being a regional tyrant to a truly historical monster. He didn't actually start the Great Purge, but he took it over from his predecessor, a guy named Nikolai Yezhov, and he turned it into this terrifyingly efficient machine of state murder. And in a classic move, one of his first acts was to have Yezhov himself purged and executed.
So when Beria first took over, he put on this big show of undoing the excesses of the guy before him. They called it the Beria Thaw, and he even released about 100,000 prisoners. But this was all just PR. It was smoke and mirrors. He created this brief illusion that things were getting better, but behind the scenes, he was quietly making the whole system of terror more disciplined, more systematic, and honestly, way more insidious.
Under Beria, torture wasn't just something that happened. It was official policy, refined into a sadistic science. The famous theater director, Vsevolod Meyerhold, he described his interrogation. They beat the soles of his feet and his spine so brutally that he said, and I quote, "The pain was so intense that it felt as if boiling water was being poured on these sensitive areas." In another case, a top official had his eye gouged out right there in Beria's office, while Beria just calmly watched.
Of all his crimes, though, few are as chillingly cold-blooded as the Cotton Massacre. So after the Soviets invaded Poland in '39 with the Nazis, they captured tens of thousands of Polish military officers, police, intellectuals, you name it. To Beria, these weren't prisoners of war. Nope. They were an entire class of enemies that had to be physically wiped out to stop any future Polish resistance before it could even start.
The sheer scale of this crime is just staggering. In the spring of 1940, on Beria's direct order, the NKVD went out and systematically murdered nearly 22,000 people. They were taken to forests, shot in the back of the head, and then just dumped into mass graves. It was a literal assembly line of murder, all designed to decapitate Polish society.
And we know he was directly responsible. This isn't some later accusation. It's right there in his own words. He wrote a formal memo to Stalin labeling these prisoners hardened and uncompromising enemies of Soviet power, and he recommended the supreme penalty, shooting. Stalin and the Politburo, they just signed off on it, and Beria's men went to work.
And Katyn, as horrific as it was just one piece of the puzzle. Beria turned the Gulag system into a massive economic empire that ran on slave labor. During World War II, as the Nazis were advancing, he was busy purging the Red Army, executing generals and officers. And as the tide of the war turned, he organized the brutal deportation of entire ethnic groups, Chechens, Tartars, you name it, accusing them of collaboration. Hundreds of thousands were forced onto cattle cars, and so many of them died along the way.
But this is where the story takes one of the strangest turns in all of history. Because the same man who was overseeing all this medieval barbarism was also put in charge of the most advanced scientific project in Soviet history, building the atomic bomb.
I mean, just look at this contrast. It's unbelievable. On one side, you've got the chief of the NKVD, the hangman. On the other, you have the director of the atomic project, the ultimate manager. And he applied the exact same ruthless efficiency to both jobs. He used his huge spy network to steal American nuclear secrets, and he used his total control over the Gulag to provide the slave labor. And by all accounts, he was an incredibly effective administrator of this massive project.
Yeah. The Soviet bomb wasn't just built by scientists. It was built by a workforce of at least 330,000 people. And a huge chunk of that number was Gulag prisoners. We're talking tens of thousands forced to mine uranium and build secret nuclear cities in just horrific conditions. So the Soviet atomic bomb, the symbol of modern power, was literally built on a foundation of medieval slavery.
But Beria's evil wasn't just limited to his job. If his public life was a masterclass in systematic terror, his private life was a realm of personal, predatory horror. And this wasn't about politics or power anymore. This was about a pure, monstrous appetite.
So, we've seen the purger, and we've seen the manager. But what was he like when he took off that uniform? What was lurking just beneath the surface was a secret so vile that it really only came out after he was dead. From what his bodyguards testified to later, and from evidence they dug up after he fell, Beria was a serial rapist. He would literally cruise the streets of Moscow in his limousine, point to a young woman he liked, and his guards would just abduct her. They'd take her to his mansion, to a soundproofed office, and he would rape her. If she resisted, her family would be threatened with the Gulag, or worse. And years later, in 1993, construction workers actually found female remains buried in the garden of his old villa. The actress, Tatiana Ukhanevskaya, was one of the women he victimized. He lured her to his home, promising he'd help her family members who were in prison. When he attacked her, he just told her, simply, "Scream or not, it doesn't matter." That one quote, it just captures the absolute impunity he operated with. He was above the law, above morality, a predator with ultimate power. But a system of terror like the one Beria perfected, it's just inherently unstable. After Stalin died in March 1953, the man who had instilled fear in millions was about to be consumed by the very fear he had created. His colleagues, who knew his ruthlessness better than anyone, decided there was no way they could risk him taking Stalin's place. And here's how it all went down. After Stalin died, Beria shocked everyone by proposing liberal reforms, releasing prisoners, easing control over East Germany. His rivals, especially Nikita Khrushchev, were terrified. Was he being genuine, or was it just a cynical power play to set up his own dictatorship? Well, they weren't going to wait around to find out, so they plotted against him. At a meeting in June 1953, Khrushchev starts screaming at Beria, calling him a traitor, and on a prearranged signal, the famous war hero Marshal Zhukov and a bunch of armed officers burst in and arrested him on the spot.
Beria ended up facing the same kind of justice he'd given to countless others, a secret trial, no defense, no appeal. He was accused of everything, treason, terrorism, even being a British spy. And when they read the death sentence, the man who had watched people being tortured without flinching, who had signed thousands of death warrants, he just completely fell apart. They say he fell to the floor, sobbing and pleading for mercy. He got none. He was shot on December 23, 1953.
So, to try and wrap our heads around this monstrously complex person, we can really see him through 5 different lenses. He was the purger, the architect of terror. He was the manager, a brutally effective administrator. He was the spy master, who built this global intelligence network. He was the predator, a depraved serial rapist. And finally, in death, he became the scapegoat, as Khrushchev and the new leadership just conveniently blamed him for all the crimes of the Stalin era, basically washing their own hands of it all.
Beria's fall definitely ended the most extreme period of Stalinist terror, but it leaves us with a really chilling question. Was his execution a moment of true justice, where a monster finally got what he deserved? Or was it just the system eating one of its own, a necessary act of self-preservation before a new, maybe different, form of control could be put in place? It's something to think about.